Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about Norsca in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, a race that many people, including myself, do feel is in a dire need of a rework in Warhammer 3. Though to be clear, compared to the races that I put on the list, things are not quite as dire for Norsca in comparison to, say, the Ogres or the Vampire Coast and even the Tomb Kings. That said, there are certainly quite a few things broken about Norsca, but ultimately their campaign can work. As painful as it might be in quite a lot of respects, it is a campaign that can work. In theory, I'm not quite sure if I would want to deal with Malachi. I really don't think you can actually deal with Malachi right now in the Norscan campaign. I mean, certainly rushing him is a surefire way of getting your ass whooped. You're probably better off doing everything else other than dealing with Malachi. His AI can actually be pretty passive for a long time. I think that's by design because they were like, yeah, let's not screw over everyone that wants to play a Chaos campaign or poor Fraught over here by having them dealing with an endgame army from the beginning. I mean, Kazrak already has to deal with that. So you're probably better off, if you're playing a campaign as Strog, to go for beating up Azazel, gaining this territory, and then helping Fraught against Kislev so you get some kind of buffer. Anyway, with respect to Norsca, let me talk about the things that do actually work about the race and the things that don't work about the race. First off, the actual unit roster of Norsca was certainly quite limited because they never had any DLC, they never had an update, they were just made as a DLC for Warhammer 1, as a pre-order bonus for Warhammer 2. They weren't even made as a DLC for Warhammer 2. No, for Warhammer 1. So their roster ends up being fairly limited. Certainly, there's a good amount of beasts and a good amount of variety over here, but, I mean, yeah, there's quite a few things that do feel lackluster with the Norscan roster. I mean, you don't even have the best trolls. Stone trolls for the greenskins are significantly better. Armored Chaos Trolls or Bile Trolls that Chaos has access to are also quite a bit better. Well, when I say Chaos, I mean Nurgle and Undivided Warriors of Chaos. You don't have great cavalry. You do have Mammoths, which is all well and good, except they're expensive. Still, you do have pretty good early game infantry. Like, Marauder Berserkers, while they certainly can't take a hit from range, once they get in melee, these guys become quite brutal because they gain physical resistance, they gain melee attack. Sure, they gain rampage as well, but that's not the downside. These guys can hold their own against many units. And then at tier 3, you get Marauder Champions. The Marauder Champions with great weapons might just be the best tier 3 infantry in the entire game. That's why they're so expensive, though to be honest, they're not quite so brutal. Like, keep in mind, we're talking tier 3 infantry here. But yeah, for tier 3 infantry, I'd probably put these guys against any other tier 3 infantry in the entire game, and they could probably win because, yeah, they get rage. The downside is that they take 2 turns to recruit, but the problems aren't there. You don't have really a range roster. I mean, you have some javelins, but they're obviously not going to be good enough. Can help you with dealing with monsters because you don't really have an anti-large benefits with your infantry early on. Yes, there are Marauder Spearmen, but to be quite blunt, they're not particularly great. Decent amount of HP, but their armor, yeah, it does leave quite a bit to be desired, but they still have rage, so they can actually hold their own reasonably well. I mean, yeah, reasonable. I mean, trashy Marauder units are not really worth it all that much. Though, yeah, you do get some decent benefits with these guys. And look, Marauder great weapons as a tier 1 unit that does require barracks against other infantry, especially because of rage. Yeah, they're pretty solid. So Norsca does well in melee. The problem is many of their enemies have range power, and that lack of armor is really going to hurt you in that respect. And even if you had armor, you now got dwarves who have thunders and quarrelers, so have fun with that one. But really, it's not the unit roster that affects Norsca. There are other things that do hurt Norsca in a campaign. Let's first start with one of their unique mechanics in a campaign. When you defeat the chieftain of another Norscan tribe, you can confederate that faction. This, however, is not actually a benefit, because when you do this, obviously you're not going to be able to get all the experience that you would gain by just, occupying the enemy territory. So it's actually not worth doing, because it will ultimately hurt you in the long run if you're doing so. So the mechanic ends up being fairly redundant. I mean, it's nice, you know, to get the other Norscan Legendary Lord, but that's about it. The minor Norscan factions are not worth it unless you let them build up to begin with, which can be a viable strategy, because the more territory you get out of Norsca, the worse the situation is going to be like. But the problem is, while obviously it would be good to leave the the Varg, and to leave the Scaling on their own to build up their settlements to a higher tier and then confederate them, the issue you're going to have with that particular situation is Norscan factions don't particularly like one another. And that can honestly be quite a problem in a campaign, because it does mean typically that you're going to end up having to fight the other Norscan factions. So even if you don't want to declare war on them, they will declare war on you. Another problem that you do face in a Norscan campaign is heroes. So you can get skinwolves at tier 3, you can get mages at tier 3 and increase capacity, but the crucial thing is you've got a bunch of glass cannon units that will take damage, and even Marauder champions will take plenty of damage. And the issue with that, the only way to get increased replenishment is to get to a tier 4 building, because that's the only way to increase your hero capacity for Vimir Bale Fiends, and it's the only way to even recruit them in the first place. So even if you're thinking about abusing Tamarkan's trait, which you certainly can and can help you in quite a few ways, you still need to get to that tier 4 settlement. This is one of the main benefits that Trog does have in comparison to Wulfric, because he does start with a replenishment hero. Also, he gets a bunch of troll units, so yeah, eventually you do get the same kind of units, but having those trolls from the very beginning is a pretty solid enough benefit. I mean, Norscan Ice trolls are decent enough. I mean, not comparable to other trolls, sure, but decent enough, can get the job done. You do get Siege Attacker with them. Other issues in a Norscan campaign. Their economy is awful, and Creative Assembly deliberately nerfed this. Like, this is bizarre. I mean, it's not like Norsca's economy before the nerf was great, but they cut the economy from your main economic building by half. Now, Creative Assembly's logic in this, well, Norsca is a naval domination faction, so you should rely on controlling coastal settlements and sacking and looting income in order to get the job done. The problem with this is that while, yes, you can gain a lot of income from ports, and the Vampire Coast is weeping when you look at this, because, like, genuinely, you can start with, like, getting, oh, I'll just get 20% income from ports, and then I'll improve this, like, 40%, 60%, and then, 100%. You don't want to necessarily focus on one god over here. But the problem with this system is, while certainly the benefits over here at the top are good, the problem that you're going to encounter with this particular system is that, one, you've had different gods competing. You have to compete for the favor of different gods. So building up favor with all 4 of them is very tricky. It's very, very difficult. And once you get one to max, which you shouldn't until you've gotten at least to tier 1 with all the others, once you get to max, you can't gain favor with the other ones. So yeah, that's great. At least that's my understanding of it. Could be wrong on that. Could be changed. Really, Norsca is not in a great place. You do get very significant benefits and a good amount of income from ports, but the problem with ports and relying on port income to maintain your economies, ports are fairly vulnerable to attack. The AI may not cross a large territory on land, but they will do so via sea just to screw you over with a port. You also don't have defensive works and settlements in Norsca. I mean, no one does, but yeah, Norsca doesn't understand the concept of walls. So your garrisons, which aren't really that great to begin with, are going to be even more exposed. Like, let me be clear. Settlements with walls are not great defensive structures in theory, but you can cheese a lot of things with AI. Not having them and having crappy garrisons just invites everyone to attack you. So that's not really a great situation, especially because your garrisons aren't particularly great. So another issue over there, you're exposed to enemy attack. A lot of people do hate you, a lot of factions hate you. So even if you take control over all of Norsca fairly quickly, which you can if you play your cards right, you'll end up having to fight a lot of factions. One benefit, also downside, is that your auto-resolve is bad. You might wonder, how the hell is that a benefit? Well, the benefit is that, well, yes, obvious downside is you're going to have to fight a lot of battles manually, which is pretty awful unless you're using auto-resolve mods. The benefit is you can have a lot of factions underestimating you and attacking you directly as opposed to running away, because that does happen in a campaign. If the AI knows the auto-resolve result, or thinks it knows, it can be wrong, many times it is, and it's going to either run away from you or attack you depending on that. So you can actually take advantage of this in your campaign when you are playing as Norsca. Just something worth pointing out with respect to all of this. That you can certainly benefit from horrible auto-resolve, even if the tedium of fighting a lot of battles manually does certainly get to you. I recommend auto-resolve mods. Still, economic limitations, especially on land, but it actually gets worse because building favor with the gods, with the various gods, with and I'm not sure why this is bugging out, sorry about that, it's like trying to, give an epilepsy episode to people. That's not a bug that I noticed before, by the way, so maybe that's new. But the problem with this is you can only gain favor with the gods by raising settlements. So you end up in this horrible situation where in order to fuel your economy, you want to sack settlements. In order to get favor of the gods, you want to raise settlements, but then you want the territory anyway for various purposes. Hero capacity, income, as limited as it is. So that ends up creating a horrible gameplay loop. An important fact, you actually do want some very specific settlements if you are playing as Norsca. You want some very specific settlements because they will give you various benefits on the campaign side of things. So it's like, oh, you took down a really powerful provincial capital of the enemy. Great, now enjoy rebuilding it. I mean, it's not like you have cheap building costs either in the Norscan campaign. They're not the worst, but they're certainly not the cheapest either. They're not greenskin level. It's better than the Vampire Coast, to be sure. It's better than Ogres. It's better than many other factions, but it's kind of a horrible situation over here. Also, it's horrible how many of these things are blocked behind, oh, let me go and capture certain things from half the world away. That's not a fun experience, I'm going to tell you. I mean, it can certainly be very, very powerful if you do get all these benefits, but it's not fun having to, first off, spend a lot of turns unlocking research. I mean, it can work in the long term, but there's a lot of tedium. Raising settlements, sacking settlements because you need the money because you're not going to necessarily generate a lot of money without sacking settlements, especially in the early game. And without sacking settlements, even in the late game, you're not going to be able to maintain your economy, having limitations on settlements, and so on and so forth. Your climate, at the very least, is good enough, though. I mean, it is really good, right? I mean, having only magical forest and desert is unpleasant works pretty well, let me put it like that. Like having every other climate except that and ocean, and there's only one territory with ocean, does end up working fairly well in a campaign. Research tree is a mess, suffice to say. It really could use an update, as do many other research tree. Like that would be, something of a running theme. I'm not sure if I would call it one of the worst research trees in the world, because, there's a Vampire Coast research tree and Ogre research tree, but it's not particularly great. And then finally, we get something else to worry about. Let's talk about, so you gotta defeat all the challengers sent against you, attain level 3 allegiance to win the campaign. Let's talk about monster hunts. So getting that allegiance is not particularly fun, but you know what's not fun at all? Monster hunts. The reason monster hunts are not fun at all is not that you have an adventure like Malachi, which does it well. You have various quest-like objectives in the same vein that it worked in Warhammer 1. And let me be blunt about it, it was freaking awful in Warhammer 1. It's certainly in replayability. Because remember, this was a faction designed for Warhammer 1. So you end up having objectives that require you to traipse around the world, waste time, They've been buggy for a long time. I think they're less buggy now. Pretty sure I've noticed that at the very least. But it does require multiple steps. And you ultimately cap it off with a quest bell that gives you a monster hunt. I mean, there's quite a few of them, but it's just not interesting because you have a lot of traipsing around to do. And you want to do these monster hunts. Actually, you're pretty much obliged to do these monster hunts. So you got a lot. So Norsca could work better with an economic buff, could work better with a bigger unit roster. So if you just had a lore pack, a unit pack for Norsca, and just lowering the hero capacity for the replenishment hero you have, that would be much better. If we got an economy on land that was actually worth it, so an economic rebalance, which would not be a complete rework, it would be much better. Research Tree doesn't need an absolute rework, but I mean, this is one of those races where the steps needed to actually fix them and make their campaigns far more enjoyable are not necessarily on the same level that, say, someone like Dwarves or Empire needed. Because yes, there were some very substantial changes needed. Don't get me wrong, though. I would certainly appreciate a lot of effort put into Norsca because they could be a lot more interesting than they are right now. And in point of fact, if they made Norsca interesting, I think they would be one of the more interesting cast factions to actually play. Because Warriors of Cast, really good faction, but just boring to play. Not a lot of risk reward in that situation. Just lots of rewards, very little risk. Demons of Cast, yeah, pretty frustrating. They improved Nurgle, but there's still work to be done on that. So it's interesting to think about Norsca, because for a long time they were actually the best cast faction to play, compared to Warriors who were freaking horrible, and Beastmen were really horrible. Like, remember, Beastmen was the Beastmen rework was the last DLC of Warhammer 2. So yeah, Beastmen were pretty terrible. So Norsca for a long time was the best one. Now it can reasonably argue that they're one of the worst ones. Well, except Daniel, right? But Daniel, I don't even like the Undivided Demons of Chaos. I don't even consider their own race, because if it wasn't their own race, Be'lakor would have been an undivided Legendary Lord. It would, by the way, make sense, because you look at Undivided Demons, they can get all the demons from various factions. They made them Warriors Cast Legendary Lord because it's like, yeah, Daniel's horrible, and we just spent all this time reworking the Warriors of Chaos, so let's make Be'lakor a Legendary Lord for Warriors of Chaos. Doesn't make sense, because Be'lakor, he's like, because Archaon is the guy who leads Undivided Warriors of Chaos in the lore, not Be'lakor. Be'lakor leads Undivided Demons in the lore, or at least Age of Sigmar, if I'm correct on that. But yeah, Daniel doesn't count. Realistically, to be blunt about it, if we were talking about a race that needs complete overhaul, it would obviously be Daniel, Yuri, whatever, the Demon Prince. It's such a silly, stupid thing. It's like you have a character that builds up in the tutorial to have like this great, awesome story, and then it's like, oh, you can name him however you want. So stupid. Genuinely so freaking stupid. Yeah, forget the Godslayer, just like Creative Assembly has forgotten. The thing that kind of annoys me about Daniel is not the fact I care so much. If they never rework him, whatever, who cares, right? It's just a missed opportunity with him, because they could have made it far better than it actually ended up being. Norsca, yeah, more units would certainly be nice. Units with Wallbreaker would certainly be nice. Better heroes, better economy, not being screwed over from all angles would also be nice with respect to them, and not having those annoying monster hunts. So redesigning the monster hunts, redesigning the research tree, redesigning the system over here, because again, having to sack, raise, and occupy settlements is a really frustrating experience in a campaign, but that's basically what you have to do. It is not fun. That's my thing with Norsca. That's one of the reasons I don't really enjoy playing them. It's not because they're horrible to play, not because they don't have the army potential or even the economic potential, because you can earn a lot of money in the Norscan campaign. You can get a lot of money from sacking settlements, in point of fact. Unlike some other factions, looking at you, Vampire Coast, yeah, it's pathetic how Vampire Coast, a race of pirates, doesn't have good sacking income. I know, absolutely ridiculous, but it's true. Norsca can get ridiculous sums of money for sacking settlements, but you're screwed over by other systems in your campaign. So enjoy dealing with that. And, you don't even have the same kind of benefits that you don't even have the same kind of benefits that Vampire Coast have, who can at least set up camp in a province, right? You have a raiding camp, and it's not like the greenskins who can just, you know, set it up with no movement range. Oh, you have to have movement range. That's a really fun experience, I gotta tell you, with respect to that. So yeah, not great to deal with that kind of stuff in a campaign. Just, I would say it's more in need of an update as opposed to just a complete rework, but I would certainly not say no to a rework. That's all I had to say. Questine here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. And if you'd like to, consider donating via PayPal or Patreon. I would greatly appreciate it. Going through some very difficult times at the moment, personally. Well, a lot of people are at the moment in the world. It's a mess out there. Stay tuned.